Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us once again. We've got another video and another poem to look at. So, this time we're going to be looking at London by William Blake. So, we have looked at the first poem in the Power and Conflict book, which is, of course, Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. Now, we're going to have a look at London. We'll go over very quickly some of the key points about what this poem is about, so you know what that is about. So, as we mentioned in the last video as well, it's going to be a relatively quick look at the poems and looking at some key quotes and feelings as well. Due to the lack of time, you have until the exams begin, so we're not going to go into too much depth and detail in these videos. But we'll try to cover the basics and just make sure that you are relatively well aware of what's really taking place and some of the key quotes. Okay, so we'll just briefly mention William Blake then, so a bit about him. So he was someone who had strong political and social views, and some of the things he was pushing for is sort of more socialist ideas and values. So, for those of you who are studying perhaps in Inspector Goals with J.B. Priestley and Dickens, you should know a little bit about socialists and socialism and what this calls for. And this poem is basically a look at some of the things which Blake feels is wrong with society, and that's London. So, at the time, of course, that this was produced, or at the time that it was written, it was time just following the Industrial Revolution. So, of course, London was changing from how it was when Blake was a boy, where perhaps a lot more scenery was there and a lot more natural beauty to experience. However, now with the emergence of the Industrial Revolution and a lot more people populating the city, and things change much more than what he would like, certainly. So he is someone who was not very happy with perhaps how the city is now looking. And of course, this is a first person narrative as he walks through the city of London, and he talks about how really wherever he looks there is misery and everybody seems to be affected by it. So there isn't really anyone who is spared by it. And of course, that's something that is covered in stanza 2. So just to remind you, so the ones, the lines, the quotes rather, in red, those are the ones that I would suggest that you can look to go with as quotes to look to memorize. So, as we mentioned as well before, ideally 3 or so quotes would be fine to be getting you through, but of course, you do want to be trying to push yourself if you can and trying to memorize more. So, say up to 5 and even perhaps more than that from each point. Okay, so going back to the second stanza then, so you can see that there, and that's something maybe you'd want to bring in as well as a repetition there with the in every cry every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band. So of course that's something that you could comment on, which really just reiterates how bad it is and how dire and desperate the situation is. So everybody really is affected by the misery. So, of course, going back to Blake then, so he wants to not just tell us a little bit about how London is looking at the moment, but who he feels is responsible for this as well. And he tries to do this indirectly, looking at some of the culprits who he feels are responsible. So, of course, we can surmise, we can guess that he is referring to the church. So the church, they typically had a close connection with power and ruling within society. The monarchy and the wealthy landowners as well. So they typically were the ones that were in power and in control, and he feels that they are not really doing anything at all to help change the situation within society. So perhaps again it is a bit of an attack at capitalism, but certainly it's another poem, and you'll find a lot of poems actually within this Power and Conflict book that are relatively critical, of those that are in power, and that usually does include the church as well. So Blake was someone who was, could or can say, anti-religious. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the quotes, and then we'll look to move on from there. So the first line, that's something that you'd want to cover. So I wander through each charted street. So first person narrative. So of course this helps to make it seem a lot more real. So it's a first-hand account. So then we can feel a much closer connection to what is happening. So they are telling us about what they see and what they hear, and this makes any audience much more inclined to listen. And of course, we can guess that it's going to be authentic as well, so it's not just hearsay. So the wander is something that's quite interesting. So they are wandering through these streets, but also as well the wander. We could also say they are perhaps wandering as well, uh, in terms of really what's happening to his city. So that's maybe something you could look to comment on as well. And the charted street as well, something that's quite interesting, of course, is a reflection of how really every street is maintained, and of course, this is registered by the government, and it just creates a sense of control there. And ultimately, with each charted street, and in the opening, we get a real idea that every street, every area, part of London is affected. The next quote, every blackening church appalls. So quite a bit there that you can look to take away from that. So again, we've got the repetition of every. And of course, the parts that follow that would be the blackening of the church. And therefore, as it's an attack on the church as well, we can guess from that that Blake feels that this is systematic, that it's not perhaps just one or two churches perhaps who are not really opening themselves up to the public and supporting them and looking to provide socialist services, help for the homeless and so on, but it's a systematic problem, and he of course is trying to hint as well, therefore, that the church perhaps are no longer fit to be those that have power. So the blackening, is of course quite an interesting word. So this could be in relation to the blackening which has been caused within London by the factories and so on as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So that's something that you could comment on with that. For a second meaning could also be the corruption as well. So the figurative sense there. So the blackening, of course, as I've just mentioned there, with the physical sense, this time perhaps blackening, which is as a result of the corruption and the tarnishing being created by the church, so not really looking after its people. And of course, again, this could be another attack of the Industrial Revolution as well. And then the appalls there as well, so just commenting on really how bad things are there, so that's something you could comment on too. And finally, we have blast the newborn infant's tear. Now you could perhaps bring in and blights with plagues, the marriage host. Haven't put that there, although the last line is something that's ideal and perhaps you want to use that. But just because it doesn't feel perhaps as easy to remember. However, perhaps if you can remember blights with plagues, then you can look to go with that as well. So the plagues is something that perhaps is just mentioning really here within this stanza, which of course could be reference to the STDs as well within London taking place as a result of widespread prostitution and so on. So the youthful harlot's curse, which has been mentioned a couple of lines before, that is of course something that is noteworthy here. And this stanza, more or less, is a criticism of not the church this time or those that are in power, but the men within society. Of course, the patriarchal society and those that are causing these plagues and so on, which we've just mentioned in the last line. But the line before, blast the newborn infant's tear, really just suggests how there's very strong emotional language, and the blasts there's something that you could really comment on there as well. So really just robs all children, infants of their innocence, just as it mentions there with their tears, and ultimately they are not able to have, we can say, a natural life even from a very young age. And of course this could be a further reference to the Industrial Revolution, how this has created perhaps this artificial sort of society now where children are being born, and of course they are experiencing problems as well. Now of course a lot of the problems from Industrial Revolution with all factories and the pollution and so on would have added to the number of problems to the health of many children, and of course many of those living within the streets of London. So that's something else, say, you can look to comment on there. Okay, so I think perhaps we could leave that there, and I hope that helps. So this has been London by William Blake. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so. Feel free to leave a comment and share with others. We'll be going through the rest of the series of Power and Conflict very soon as well. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for listening. Take care and bye for now.